Okay, in our second session, we're going to stick with Czechoslovakia, and it's another one of our sessions where we look at an individual. We've looked, haven't we, at Čapek? We've looked at Česlav Miloš. We're now going to look at Václav Havel. And in a couple of weeks' time, or even next week, actually, we're going to look at my personal favorite, Ludmila Zhivkova, the daughter of the Bulgarian communist leader Todor Zhivkov, and a fascinating figure in her own right. But that's for next week. This week we're looking at Václav Havel, and I want to speak a little bit about his life story, and then talk about his essay, which is one of the most important essays of anti-communist resistance in the Eastern Bloc. The essay is called "The Power of the Powerless," and we'll talk a little bit about the contents of that. I'm not sure if you've heard of Václav Havel. It's likely that you haven't, but you may have done. And it's completely fine if you haven't, but it's great if you have. For people my age, which is just sort of 5 or 6 years older than most of you, Havel would be a household name as much as Nelson Mandela or Margaret Thatcher or Mikhail Gorbachev. He is and was, of course he's dead now, died in 2011, but in his day he was the most famous of the anti-communist so-called dissidents, and we'll talk about that word in a minute, what the word dissident means in this context. But I'm kind of acutely aware that, just as there are household names from the 80s, 70s and 80s that I wouldn't know, that it's not necessary that you would know Havel. The world has moved on, and of course there are other household names. But his life is fascinating, and I want to recommend, if you are interested in Havel, and I hope that some of you are, I can recommend two very good books. One is called Disturbing the Peace, which was published originally in the 1980s, I think the middle of the 1980s, and is based on an interview that Havel had with somebody whose name I've forgotten. But essentially the interviewee asks him about various things, and essentially sort of finding out about his life, and asks him about his his upbringing and his background and this kind of thing. So it functions very well as a biography, but it's kind of Havel in his own words. Another very good book is by an author called Michael Zhanatovsky. And Zhanatovsky was very close to Havel. He was ambassador, I think, to the United States in the 1990s and the beginning of the 21st century. Knew Havel very well, had access to his library and his personal effects after Havel died, and wrote what I think is the best biography, Havel, A Life. There are other biographies, and some of them are very good. There's a biography by my friend Kieran Williams. His biography is short and very good, and deals mainly with Havel's plays and his writing. Havel was a playwright, I'll explain that in a minute. But Zhanatovsky is, I think, the most interesting one. It's a very positive, very sympathetic biography, but he doesn't blanch from a few of the sort of less saintly aspects of Havel's life. Havel had a very bad attitude. Havel was a notorious philanderer, and he talks a lot about his affairs, which of course were very embarrassing to his wife. So we'll talk about that as well. Okay, so Havel, who was he? Well, the Havel family was a very wealthy family of magnates in pre-war Czechoslovakia, so in the interwar period. The Havel family had made a huge amount of money, and they were very wealthy, a sort of well-off family, one of the mainstays of Czechoslovak society in the First Republic. A couple of their interests, a couple of their possessions, you can see in slide number 3. On the left-hand side, this is the Prague Barrandov Studios. So, you remember last week we talked a little bit about the Czechoslovak New Wave. A lot of the movies were made at these studios, one of the best in Central Europe. Filmmaking properties, filmmaking sites. But the Barrandov complex is sort of at the edge of Prague. It overlooks the river Vltava. You can just about see it in this image. There's also a restaurant. There were some fancy villas. And in the interwar period in Masaryk's Republic, in the 1920s and the 1930s, the Barrendorf restaurant and the Barrendorf complex was really one of the best places to be. It was the sort of the place where the intellectuals like Čapek and these sorts of people hung out. So the Havel family owned that, and they were a very important part of the Czechoslovak society. The other one is on the right. It's the Lucerne nightclub, disco, cinema, cafe, restaurant. It's in the middle of Prague. It's just off the Wenceslas Square. And it's also, it was also a very sort of fashionable and very good place to hang out if you were wealthy and well off. So the Havel family were very rich and very wealthy, and one of the most important families in interwar Czechoslovakia. At the end of the second one, and Havel was sort of Havel. His grandfather was the sort of the great patriarch of the Havel family. But Havel was very young during the Second World War, and basically sort of he finished high school. I think he entered high school at the end of the Second World War, and of course when the communists came to power, this was one of the things they addressed quite early on. The fact that there were families like the Havel family who had a lot of wealth. Their property like the Lucerne and the Barrendorf studios were requisitioned and were nationalized. So the movies that were made there after the Second World War were made by the state. They were not Havel's interests any longer. And that was quite typical throughout the Eastern Bloc, actually, that those wealthy families, that their wealth, which was felt to have been taken away from them, that they took away from the working people, was given back to the working people, given back to the nation, and they were sort of made to live in just like the rest of us, in small apartments and small flats and this kind of thing. So Havel was born into wealth, but he was very quickly stripped of that wealth at a very young age. Now the other thing is that there's a kind of stigma in communist societies if you come from those sorts of backgrounds. If you're not a worker, if you're not a soldier, if you have that sort of bourgeois or aristocratic background, or if your family were part of the church, for example, it means you have a sort of a black mark against your CV. And it never really leaves. And Havel was sort of dogged by that mark of Cain throughout his early career. He was seen as a son of a person who exploited the labor of the working people, and as a result of this, it was very difficult for him to get into university. It was very difficult for him to get a job. Very difficult for him to join the Communist Party, although Havel didn't want to join the Communist Party. That was it was one of these kind of upending of the old order, that the people who used to have a lot of money had that taken away from them, and the Havel family were one of them. So Havel was born in 1936, so he was very young then. At the end, he was still in high school at the end of the Second World War. He was interested in acting in the theatre, and he wanted to do that originally when he came of age. But because the communists were in power, because of his family background, it was very, very difficult for Havel to get into that. And eventually, at least initially, he went into the technical school, technical college. Now, in 1964, he met earlier, but in 1964, he ultimately married what we might call the great love of his life, although certainly not the only love of his life, a woman called Olga Shplikalova. Let's call her Olga Havlova, just to make it more simple. And there's a picture of Olga there. Now, Olga is also passed very sadly. She died before Havel, I think in sort of the late 1990s even. But Olga was Havel's companion throughout his life, through all of the trials and the tribulations that he went through. She was very different from Havel. She grew up in a district of Prague called Žižkov, which is historically the working class district. So she came from a very different background. They met at a theatre, actually. She was working backstage, and he was sort of involved in the theatre. And that's where the two of them initially met. And they stayed together throughout up until her death in I think it was in 1998, but I'm not too sure. It was a very close bond, very close companionship. It was certainly love. But at the same time, Havel, as I said a moment ago, was a notorious philanderer. He had numerous affairs of of varying levels of seriousness. Some were simply one night stands, others lasted for years. There was one woman, a theatre actress, that he sort of, who was also married, that he was basically sort of seeing for a very long time. And then Olga kind of had to put up with this. And Havel handled this in a very strange way. His sort of approach to the guilt that he felt for cheating on Olga was to sort of come home and kind of basically confess to her, to tell her what he had done and what he was doing and this sort of relationship. So it was very strange. It was kind of, it was an open relationship only in the sense that it was open for Havel. Olga did have an affair as well, which infuriated Havel at some point, but it was a very, Olga put up with a lot. There's a very interesting, he wrote, he was imprisoned as we'll find out later on in the 1980s. He wrote a series of letters to his wife from prison. They're published and they've been translated into English as letters to Olga. And they're very interesting. You get a real sense of the relationship that these two people have. Havel is not permitted to write about political matters. Those letters would be censored. He finds ways around this sometimes by using coded language, using symbols, being very careful. But very often he's just writing about mundane things. It's quite fascinating in a strange sort of Beckettian way. He talks about the garden a lot. He's obsessed with the fence in his garden home and is always asking Olga to paint it. He's a bit of a mansplainer to Olga. He kind of talks in a very patronizing way, and you can see that he's kind of upper class and that he looks on her as much love and affection he has for her. He also sort of looks on her as a sort of a slightly rough and ready working class girl who needs to sort of he recommends books and tells her to read them, and it's a bit unfair to Olga because she was very intelligent and also studied at underground universities, philosophy, and was more than a match actually for Václav Havel. Now, Havel's first interest was writing plays. He was a writer, and he wrote some very interesting plays that were produced and staged in the 1960s. So during this time of sort of liberalization and relaxation of the regime, during this sort of the Dubček, coming up to the Dubček era, the sort of the era of the so-called Prague Spring. And his plays were, sort of what we would call absurdist plays, a little bit like Samuel Beckett or Eugene Ionesco, the French playwright, and maybe someone like the British playwright Harold Pinter. I don't know if those names mean anything to you. Samuel Beckett, of course, you'll know who that is. The plots were quite strange. They were incongruous. The dialogue was nonsensical at times. And Havel was kind of teasing out the sort of what he saw as the absurdities of human existence, but to a certain extent also the absurdities of living under communism and this kind of what he saw as a very dysfunctional political regime. His best plays, considered to be his best plays, are The Garden Party and The Memorandum, and you can find those relatively easy. They're still in print, and they occasionally get revivals as well. They're very often here in Prague or in the Czech Republic, but even in places like the West End and on Broadway, that they were staged in the 60s and the 70s. And they remain relatively interesting and relatively popular. Now, he was involved in 1968. He was in a Czech town called Liberec, which is on the border, in the northern border of Bohemia, in the north of Bohemia. He didn't take a hugely active role, but he was sort of broadcasting radio messages from the local radio during this period. And at the end of 1968, like many of his kind, many intellectuals, it was simply impossible for him even to stage his plays any longer. And that was very typical of the period of normalization that I mentioned in the previous session. The communists, sort of removed intellectuals, university professors, writers, philosophers, removed them from their vocation and gave them jobs like electricians and in Havel's case, he worked in a beer brewery. Other people cleaned windows. So I mean, it was kind of it was a very bizarre time you would have in the 1970s. It was not out of the question that you would call a plumber, and the plumber would be the best, existential philosopher in the country, or had been in the 1960s, or some sort of great, some great sort of author of novels like Ludwig Watzlawick or something like that. They would now be working as a plumber. Nothing wrong with being a plumber, of course, but it was not the vocation that it would not have been their first choice. Now he became politically active now as a dissident in normalized Czechoslovakia, and I think we just need to sort of explore that term a little bit. If we move now to slide number 7. The term dissident generically means somebody who in the 1970s and the 1980s is opposed to the communist regime, is actively politically opposing it in one way or the other. It was a phrase that was more often used outside of the country. Havel himself had a very awkward relationship with the word dissident, didn't refer to himself as a dissident, didn't like this generic term because he felt that it created a sense of unity which there wasn't in reality. Anti-communist opposition was, the Polish Catholic Church, the Romanian Lutheran Church, intellectuals in Czechoslovakia, but it was also, for example, in Yugoslavia, people who had been part of the Communist Party but had now dropped out of the Communist Party. So it was a very sort of polymorphous movement. And the term dissident was very often one which was imposed from the West onto Central and Eastern Europe, and like I say, it was one that Havel didn't. He was usually termed and deemed the most important of the dissidents, but it was a term he himself didn't wear very comfortably. There's an excellent book which I believe we have as e-copy in the library by a literary historian, an American called Jonathan Bolton. The book is called Worlds of Dissent. It's about the Czechoslovak dissident movement, and it's an incredible, beautifully written, and a great sort of account of the notion of dissident, the atmosphere in which the dissidents live, and that's probably the best sort of scholarly account, and I highly recommend it. It's a great read. There's also another book which I recommend. It's by a Czech author called Ludwig Watzlawick. It's only just been published into English, and I read it recently, and the publication is excellent. It's called The Czech Dream Book. Ludwig Watzlawick was an author, a Czech author who wrote novels in the 1960s. And if you remember from our last session, it was he who wrote the manifesto of the reform movement in 1968, the so-called 2,000 words, where he talked about what needed to change, what he expected to happen. He sort of summarized the reform movement. He fell into a terrible sort of depression and writer's block under normalization, and simply couldn't write anything more than sort of 500 words. Fouelletons, couldn't write a novel, couldn't sort of do any serious writing, and this was creating a huge amount of despair for him. And eventually he sat down and he wrote a sort of a diary, dream book. So, dream book is where you sort of get up in the morning and you write the things that you dreamt about the night before. But this became an entire sort of account of a year of his life, but also a year of this sort of dissident circles. It's really an incredible book which explains the atmosphere of normalized normalized Czechoslovakia, but also the atmosphere within these dissident movements. We meet Václav Havel, we meet various other people. We find out about the daily life of living under communism, the interrogations at the hands of the secret police, which were not always as unpleasant as you might think. They were quite friendly. In some cases, it's a fascinating book. We learn all about the sort of mores and the attitudes of the of the Czechoslovak dissidents. There's some shocking moments, I must admit. The attitude that they have towards women, for example, is pretty disgraceful, frankly. Vaculík is also having numerous affairs. Women feature as just sort of, his sort of, just women that he's screwing around with, or they're just people who are typing up his great works. And unfortunately, the relationship that Václav Havel had with Olga was quite typical of those Czechoslovak dissidents, which is something that we for a long time we didn't talk about, because we admired those people so much and their heroic resistance to communism. But now, with more sort of interest in feminist issues in the field, we are talking more about those things. Now, Havel really came to his fore. If we turn to slide number 8, the moment Havel became really politically engaged was in the 1970s. And the turning point, which Jonathan Bolton writes about very nicely in his book, was a trial of a psychedelic pop group called the Plastic People of the Universe. And I put a picture of them there. And I've also put up one of their songs, which I would like you to listen to, and it's not a bad one. I'm not, I'm not crazy about the Plastic People of the Universe, who are still together, incidentally, but this song is quite good. Now, the Plastic People of the Universe were sort of, as you can see, kind of like hippies, dropouts from society, and throughout the bloc, those sorts of groups, punks. People who were living alternative lives, people who didn't cut their hair, were a problem for the communist regime, because they didn't want to get jobs, they didn't want to fit in, they didn't want to go to party movements. They were non-conformists, and this was this really irritated the communist regime, and it's the same, incidentally, in the Soviet Union. You have some great writing about the punk movements of the 1980s, and how the Soviet Communist Party believed this was some sort of political resistance, but actually it was just people drinking and sort of smoking pot and just chilling out. And so the Plastic People of the Universe were a problem for the Communist Party, and they were worried about them, and worried about the role that they were playing, and wanted to try to sort of come to terms with how to deal with them. And in the middle of the 1970s, they put them on trial. I think that the charges were anti-communist attitude. So it was a ridiculous kind of trial. And Havel saw this. Havel, was not a huge fan of them either. The kind of music that Havel liked was things like the Bee Gees and sort of naff music, easy listening. But he saw that what was happening to the Plastic People, the Plastics, was a sort of not a fair trial. That these people were being put on trial for, that they were not guilty of anything other than not conforming to the precepts of communist society. So it became a great cause célèbre, and for Havel, this was an example of how the communist regime were not respecting individual rights, were not respecting communist rights, and it was very much a moment of political activism and political activation for Havel. Now, incidentally, one of the funniest, albeit unwittingly, one of the funniest episodes of the television series Maya Zeman, so the one that I talked about in the previous lecture, is one where a band like the Plastic People of the Universe are featured. And it is really a hilarious episode. This band are simply, first of all, they're wearing blue jeans, which is a terrible sign of Americanization and of anti-communist attitudes. They're smoking pot, they're getting high. At one point, they decide they want to try and hijack a plane and fly it to San Francisco or something like this, some hippie hellhole in the capitalist West. And Maya Zeman intervenes, and the way that this band, which are meant to be the Plastic People, is depicted is just sort of ridiculous. They're hysterical. There's one woman who's shrieking and she's off her head on drugs. And it's kind of hilarious, but it does show just how sort of nervous the communist regime were about the plastic people. I do actually have a clip of this episode. I might try and find it. My friend Paulina did send me this, and it does have subtitles as well. It lasts about 15 minutes, and I might try. It's the scene where they hijack the plane, which is which is just brilliant. Anyway, coming back to the history for a moment. So this is how Havel got involved. But there was another thing. I don't know how well you know the history of the Cold War, but in 1975, at a summit meeting in Helsinki, the Soviets met with the Americans, and they agreed on various things: nuclear reduction, the reduction of arms, normalization of relations, diplomatic relations. But there was also a so-called third basket of agreements, which the Soviets and the Communist bloc agreed to respect the human rights and the civil rights of people who lived in the communist world. So freedom of association, freedom of press, freedom of speech, all of these sorts of things. Now, the Soviets didn't take these seriously, of course. They had no intention of following through. This was just something to appease the Americans, and they believed that this is something they could very quickly sort of sweep under the carpet when they got home. But for Havel and for his fellow activists, that third basket, wherein the Soviets and the communists had agreed to respect the human rights of their citizens, became the sort of sticking point. Havel would sort of demand that the agreement that was reached in Helsinki in 1975 needed to be sort of adhered to, needed to be upheld. And his intention was to sort of expose what he felt was the hypocrisy, what he rightly felt was the hypocrisy of the communist regime. So in 1977, he formed a movement called Charter 77. It was a petition in which he solicited signatories of people who would agree with this sort of complaint and agree with the demand, quite simply, that the communist regime in Czechoslovakia, wherever it was, would uphold the civil and individual rights of the citizens. This was simply the intention of Charter 77, that they would ask the communist regime, they would sort of say to the communist regime, you said you would respect freedom of press, you said you would respect freedom of association, but patently you're not doing that. Look what happened to the plastics. Look what happens to people in our country. That was the gist of the petition. And it became one of the most famous, if not largest, dissident movements in the bloc. Now, it must be said that as admirable as what Havel and his co-signees were doing, this was always a very small movement. At the maximum, the number of signatories of the charter were just over 1,000 people. 1,065, I think, was the final total. This in a country of more than 10 million people. So it's very different, for example, from the movement that we'll be talking about next week, the Polish Solidarity movement, which was a trades union movement, which was a mass movement, had millions of members. Charter 77 was always a very small group of people, heroic, people who sacrificed, people who were persecuted for what they were doing, but nevertheless not something that had lighted the rest of normalized Czechoslovakia. And it was always a great regret of Havel and the rest of the so-called Chartists that there were only a few people who, when push came to shove, would be willing to sign this. Now, the communist regime also saw what was going on, and they mobilized a counter-movement called the Anti-Charter, which they had many tens of thousands of people signed, but of course they essentially forced them to do that on fear of losing their jobs or losing their apartments or something like this. So the communist regime held sort of like counter rallies to sort of isolate and demoralize the Chartists. And in slide number 10, you can see a couple of the most famous anti-charter anti-charter rallies. And this picture on the right-hand side is a picture of a very famous comedian, an actor, and musician, a man called Jan Rerik, who was extremely popular in the First Republic. And you can see he's sitting at one of these anti-charty rallies that he's been forced to attend, and he's utterly sort of bored and exasperated and appalled by the whole thing, that he has to sit through hours and hours of this droning on, and it's one of the best images actually of the sort of the attitudes of the anti-charter movement. Okay. So, final slide, number 11, the essay, The Power of the Powerless. It was published in 1978. And it was the culmination of various thoughts that Havel was having about the communist movement, about resisting it, about dissidents, about his fellow citizens, about the charter, about all of these things. And it became probably the most important political and philosophical statement that Havel made, but also one of the most important statements of the late communist period, so the period of communism, 1970s, 1980s. And in it, Havel, he sort of talks about the regime in Czechoslovakia, and he sort of acknowledges that this is not a terror state in the way, for example, it may have been in the 1950s, or the Soviet Union was in the 1930s, or perhaps, who knows, somewhere like I don't know, Saddam Hussein's Iraq or something like that. This was no longer the nature of the regime. They were not widespread terrorizing the population. They were using more subtle methods. This was a different kind of dictatorship. This was a different kind of regime. It was a regime, it seemed, to Havel, that could only function with the complicity and the tacit acquiescence of the Czechoslovak people themselves. And Havel uses a very famous metaphor. He talks about a greengrocer who has a shop somewhere in Czechoslovakia, let's say in Prague. And he says every May Day, and you'll know that on May Day there was a big parade and a big celebration. And it was a requirement for people to sort of put posters of Lenin and put posters of Gustav Husak and put party slogans on their windows. They were required to do this. And Havel talks about this greengrocer. And he says he goes to his window on May Day or the night before May Day, and he puts up on his window an image, a slogan: "Workers of the world, unite! You have nothing to lose but your chains." It comes from the Communist Party, a manifesto by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. And Havel says, something strange is happening here, because this greengrocer doesn't believe what he's doing. He doesn't believe in this slogan. He doesn't believe in workers of the world uniting. He lives in a country where it's patently false. It's after 1968. It's after everything that's happened. The Communist Party is not emancipating people like him. It's not enriching him. It's not doing the things it should be doing. But nevertheless, he goes through these motions. He puts up this poster, and he acts as if it is true. And he says the problem here is that this greengrocer is not living in truth. He's living a lie. And he says you replicate this lie many millions of times at every level of society, and you essentially have the communist organism. You have the mechanics, you have the sort of the mechanism through which the Czechoslovak Communist Party is remaining in power. Every greengrocer in the country more or less is doing the same thing. So is every tailor, so is every baker, so is every party functionary, so is every school teacher. Everyone right up, from the bottom, the guy who catches dogs or something like this, all the way up to Gustav Husak himself. All of them are sort of enacting this falsehood. They're acting as if the slogans of the Communist Party, the ideology of the Communist Party is a living, breathing, truthful thing, when in fact it isn't. So why are they doing this? Quite simply, of course, they're doing this for the quiet life. The greengrocer knows that if he doesn't put up If he doesn't put up this poster, he's going to get stick and hassled from the communist regime. He might not go to jail. He might not even get a fine, but the party will come to see him. They'll say, look, why are you not doing this? Why are you not putting up the sign? Put it up tomorrow. If he doesn't put it up tomorrow, then he might be in trouble. He might get a fine. If he doesn't pay the fine, he might have to go to the court. If he goes to the court, he might find a custodial sentence. There's a whole path of sort of inconvenience and trouble that lie ahead for the greengrocer if he doesn't sort of put up this falsehood. So that's why he's doing it, not because he believes it, because he just wants to stay out of trouble. And again, Havel replicated this, Havel multiplied this throughout the entirety of Czechoslovak society. And he said, essentially, this is why people are acting in the way they do. They no longer believe in communism. They know that the ideology is spent. They know that it's exhausted itself, but they're simply going through the motions. Now, what Havel extorted people to do was to sort of take down the posters. He wanted this greengrocer to take down the poster, the Marxist slogans, and to begin to, what he said, live in truth. To act as if, he knew that what the regime was doing was phony and was false. And he said that not only if the greengrocer did this, but if everyone else in the country began to do this, if everyone else simply abandoned the lie and started to live in truth, we would see that the communist regime would be exposed. It'd be like the emperor's clothes. Everyone would suddenly realize that this was a falsehood. Now, this is hence the title, The Power of the Powerless. People felt that they couldn't change the system. People felt that they were trapped within the system, that the Communist Party was not going anywhere. But as a reality, if they began simply to abandon the lies, to sort of see clearly, to live in truth, to take down the slogans, to stop repeating the slogans, that would be the beginning of the end of the communist regime. Now, of course, it suited Havel to say this because he himself, despite his many flaws and despite his many faults, was living in what he believed was to be the truth. He spent time in jail in the 1980s. Repeatedly, he was given the chance to emigrate. He never took it. To America or to the United Kingdom or to West Germany. He always declined this. He stayed in situ. His house was bugged. He was harassed by the secret police. As I say, he was imprisoned. But he was, in a sense, living his truth. And I suppose all of the people who signed the charter were doing that as well. They were taking down the slogans. They were speaking truth to power. And Havel hoped that the rest of his citizens would do the same. As a matter of fact, in the immediate case, they didn't. Of course, not until the very late period, not until the end of 1989, did this moment sort of arrive. In fact, it remained true, for better or worse, that only a very few people signed the charter. Only a very few people would have, in Havelian terms, lived in truth. That's the basic summary of the essay. It's much more complicated than that. It has a lot of philosophical ideas. It goes on for about 100 pages. It's a very good essay. It's in print. You can find it on Kindle. I highly recommend taking a look at this because it's one of the key texts of anti-communist dissidence and anti-communist resistance from the entirety of the socialist period. But essentially, that's the text. And that was Havel's message. So thank you.